My name is Sophia Carter. For most of my life, I believed hard work could solve almost anything. I believed that if you studied harder, stayed honest, and treated people with kindness, life would eventually reward you. I was wrong. Because sometimes the people who destroy your future aren't strangers. Sometimes they're family. Sometimes they're the people sitting across from you at the dinner table. And sometimes they're your own brother. But before I tell you how my brother stole my future, you need to understand where everything began. You need to understand what that college fund meant to me. Because it wasn't just money, it was a dream. A dream my parents spent years building, and a dream my brother would eventually destroy. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. It wasn't the kind of place people talked about on television. Nothing exciting ever happened there. The streets were quiet. The houses looked almost identical. And everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. My parents worked harder than anyone I knew. My mother, Sarah, was a nurse at the local hospital. She often worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer. There were nights when she came home so exhausted that she could barely keep her eyes open during dinner. But she never complained, not once. My father, Michael, owned a small auto repair shop. He wasn't rich, far from it, but people trusted him. He was honest, reliable. The kind of man who fixed things because he genuinely wanted to help people. Growing up, I admired both of them. They taught me values that shaped my entire life. Work hard, tell the truth. Keep your promises, and never take shortcuts. Those lessons became part of who I was. Unfortunately, they never became part of who my brother was. Jason Carter was 4 years older than me. And from the moment I can remember, he was different. Not necessarily bad, just different. While I spent my afternoons reading books, Jason spent his looking for excitement. While I followed rules, he tested them. While I worried about grades, he worried about having fun. My parents always said he would mature eventually. "He's just young," Mom would tell me. "He'll figure things out," Dad agreed. "Jason has a good heart." Maybe he did, at least back then. But having a good heart doesn't matter much when you keep making bad decisions. And Jason made plenty of them. One of my earliest memories involves a broken bicycle. I was 9 years old. Jason was 13. Dad had spent an entire weekend fixing up an old bike for me. He painted it blue because it was my favorite color. I loved that bicycle. 3 days later, Jason borrowed it without asking. Then he tried jumping it over a homemade ramp. The bike crashed. The front wheel bent completely sideways. When Dad asked what happened, Jason blamed another kid. And for some reason, Dad believed him. I remember standing there silently, watching Jason lie. Watching him avoid responsibility, and watching everyone move on. It was a small thing. At least it seemed small then. But looking back now, I realized something important. That was the first time Jason learned he could escape consequences. And unfortunately, it wouldn't be the last. As the years passed, our differences became even more obvious. Jason struggled in school, not because he wasn't intelligent, because he didn't care. He hated studying, hated responsibility, hated anything that required patience. He wanted quick results. Easy rewards, instant success. Meanwhile, I loved learning. Books felt like doorways into different worlds. I spent hours studying architecture magazines. Whenever I saw pictures of beautiful buildings, I felt something awaken inside me. A dream, a purpose. I wanted to design homes someday. Not ordinary homes, homes that made people feel something. Places where families could create memories. Places that felt safe, warm, permanent. I know it sounds strange for a 12-year-old girl, but that dream stayed with me, year after year. Growing stronger, becoming more real, my parents noticed, and they encouraged me every step of the way. One evening when I was 10, Dad called me into the kitchen. Mom was sitting at the table with a smile on her face. Between them sat a small folder. "What is it?" I asked. Dad pushed the folder toward me. "Open it." Inside was a bank statement. I didn't understand what I was looking at. Mom laughed. "It's your college fund." "My what?" Dad smiled. "Your college fund." I stared at them, confused. "We started saving money for your future." My eyes widened. Already? Mom nodded. We want you to have opportunities we never had. I remember feeling overwhelmed, not because of the money, but because of what it represented. Belief, faith, hope. My parents believed in my future enough to sacrifice for it, and that meant everything. From that day forward, the college fund became part of our family conversations. Not constantly, just enough to remind me that my dream mattered. Every birthday, my grandparents contributed a little money. Every Christmas, some relatives added small amounts. Mom and Dad deposited money whenever they could. Sometimes it was $50. Sometimes 100, sometimes more. Slowly, year after year, the fund grew, and so did my determination. Whenever school became difficult, I thought about that account. Whenever I felt discouraged, I remembered my parents' sacrifices. Failure wasn't an option. Too many people believed in me. Jason, however, viewed things differently. One afternoon when I was 14, he noticed me studying. Again, he rolled his eyes. "You're wasting your teenage years." I looked up. "What? All this studying?" He pointed at my books. "None of it matters," I laughed. "It matters to me." Jason smirked. "Trust me, nobody gets rich from studying." At the time, I ignored him, but over the years, I noticed something. Jason was obsessed with getting rich, not successful. Rich, there was a difference. Success required effort. Riches required luck, at least in Jason's mind. Every month he had a new idea. A new shortcut, a new scheme, a new opportunity that would supposedly make him wealthy overnight. None of them worked, of course, but that never stopped him from trying. After high school, Jason drifted from one job to another. He quit constantly. Every boss was unfair. Every workplace was terrible. Every opportunity wasn't good enough, at least according to him. Meanwhile, I continued excelling in school. My grades remained near the top of my class. Teachers encouraged me to apply to prestigious universities. Everything seemed to be moving in the right direction, at least on the surface. What I didn't realize was that trouble had already started, and its source was sitting right inside our family. By the time I turned 17, Jason was 21, still living at home, still chasing shortcuts, still depending on Mom and Dad whenever things went wrong. One evening, I overheard an argument coming from the kitchen. Dad sounded frustrated. Jason sounded angry. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. "I need another chance," Jason said. "You've had plenty of chances," Dad replied. "This one is different." "No, why not?" "Because I'm tired of throwing money away." The conversation ended with Jason storming out of the house. A few moments later, Mom appeared in the hallway. She looked worried, very worried. At the time, I didn't think much about it. Families argue, it happens. I assumed everything would eventually settle down. I was wrong. Over the following months, Jason became unusually interested in family finances. At first, it seemed harmless. He asked Dad questions about investments, savings, retirement plans, bank accounts, normal adult topics, or at least they seemed normal. Dad appeared pleased. Maybe he thought Jason was finally growing up. Maybe he believed his son was becoming responsible. I think he wanted to believe that. Parents often see what they hope to see, even when reality tells a different story. And my father wanted desperately to believe Jason had changed. Unfortunately, Jason understood that better than anyone. Spring arrived. Graduation was only months away. College acceptance letters started arriving in the mail. The day I received my acceptance from my dream university remains one of the happiest moments of my life. I ran into the kitchen screaming. Mom cried. Dad hugged me. For a few minutes, everything felt perfect. Years of hard work had finally paid off. My future was waiting, bright, exciting, full of possibilities. That night we celebrated with pizza and cake. Even Jason joined us. He smiled, congratulated me, told me he was proud. Looking back now, that smile chills me. Because it wasn't pride, it was something else, something hidden, something dangerous. At the time, I couldn't see it. None of us could. A few weeks later, I noticed something strange. Dad seemed distracted, constantly stressed, lost in thought. Mom looked anxious too. Whenever Jason entered the room, conversations stopped. Silences appeared. Uncomfortable silences. The kind people create when they're hiding something. I wanted to ask questions, but I didn't. I was focused on graduation, focused on college, focused on the future. I never imagined my future was already slipping away. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. The afternoon that shattered my world. The afternoon I came home and found my parents sitting silently at the kitchen table. Mom's eyes were red. Dad looked pale, broken, defeated. The moment I saw them, my stomach tightened. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Mom, no answer. Dad, silence. I walked closer, fear growing with every step. Finally, Dad looked up, and when I saw the tears in his eyes, I knew my life was about to change forever. Sophia, he whispered, we need to talk. And at that moment, I had absolutely no idea that my brother had already done the unthinkable. The moment Dad said, Sophia, we need to talk, I felt my heart sink. Something was terribly wrong. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from my parents. Neither of them spoke. Mom stared at the table. Dad rubbed his hands together nervously. The silence felt endless. Dad, I finally said, you're scaring me. He looked up. His eyes were filled with guilt. The kind of guilt that comes from carrying a burden that's too heavy to hide. Then he said the words that changed my life. The college fund is gone. For a second, I honestly thought I had heard him wrong. What? The money is gone, I laughed, not because it was funny. Because my brain refused to process what he was saying. What do you mean gone? Nobody answered immediately. The room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. I looked at Mom. She started crying. Real crying, the kind that comes from heartbreak. My stomach twisted. Dad, my voice barely worked. What happened? He lowered his head, and then he told me. Jason had convinced him to let him use the money for a business investment. A temporary investment. At least that was the promise. Jason claimed he had discovered an opportunity that would double the money. He said it was safe. Guaranteed. A chance to help the whole family. Dad hesitated at first, but Jason kept pushing. Kept promising, kept insisting. Eventually Dad gave in, and now, every dollar was gone, every single dollar. I stared at him, waiting for the rest. Waiting for him to tell me they recovered it. Waiting for him to say it was only a small portion. But there was no rest. That was the entire story. Jason had gambled away my future, and lost. I couldn't breathe. For years I had imagined college. I had imagined moving into a dorm, attending classes, building the future I'd worked so hard for. Now all I could think about was one question. How could my brother do this? How could my father allow it? How could everyone sit here and tell me my future had vanished? The room spun around me. I pushed my chair back and stood up. No, Dad looked up. Sophia, no, I shook my head. No, there has to be something else. There isn't. The words hit harder than anything else. There isn't. No solution, no hidden account, no miracle, nothing. Just loss. I walked out of the kitchen, then out of the house. I don't remember where I went. I just walked. Past neighbors, past parks, past streets I'd known my entire life. Tears streamed down my face. Everything felt unreal. I kept replaying the conversation over and over, trying to find a different ending, trying to wake up from what felt like a nightmare. But reality remained the same. The fund was gone, my future had changed, and my brother was responsible. Jason came home later that evening. I was waiting. The second he walked through the door, I confronted him. What did you do? He froze, only for a moment. Then he sighed, as if I was the one creating drama. Sophia, don't. My voice shook with anger. What did you do? He looked uncomfortable, but not guilty, not ashamed, just annoyed. The investment failed. Investment. The word made me sick. That was my college fund. I know, you lost everything. It wasn't intentional. I stared at him, waiting for remorse, waiting for an apology. Waiting for anything that resembled regret. Instead, he shrugged, actually shrugged. It didn't work out. 3 words, that's all he said, 3 words. As if years of sacrifices could be erased by a simple explanation. As if my future meant nothing. As if my dreams were just numbers on a bank statement. Something inside me broke that night. Not my confidence, not my ambition, my trust. The trust I had in my brother, the trust I had in my family, the trust I had in fairness itself. The following weeks were a blur. Graduation arrived. Everyone else seemed excited. Parents took pictures. Friends discussed dorms and schedules. Families celebrated. I smiled when people looked at me, then cried when they didn't. Nobody knew what was happening behind the scenes. Nobody knew I was quietly watching my dream fall apart. One afternoon, my best friend, Chloe, sat beside me after graduation rehearsal. "You should be excited," I forced a smile. "I am," she studied my face. "No, you're not," I looked away. For a moment I considered telling her everything, but I couldn't. The truth felt too humiliating. How could I explain that my own brother had stolen my future? How could I explain that my family had allowed it to happen? So I simply said I was stressed. And left it at that. That summer became one of the hardest periods of my life. While my friends prepared for college, I prepared for survival. Scholarship applications filled my bedroom floor. Financial aid forms covered my desk. Every day became a battle against time. I worked mornings at a local coffee shop, afternoons at a bookstore, evenings completing scholarship essays. Sleep became optional, exhaustion became normal, but quitting wasn't. I refused to quit, no matter how difficult things became, no matter how unfair life felt. I wasn't going to let Jason's mistakes define my future. Meanwhile, Jason acted as though nothing had happened. That was the part that hurt most. He wasn't devastated. He wasn't trying desperately to repay the money. He wasn't working 3 jobs. He wasn't sacrificing anything. He simply moved on, while everyone else dealt with the consequences. Every time I saw him laughing with friends or scrolling through his phone, anger burned inside me. Because I couldn't understand how someone could destroy another person's future and sleep peacefully at night. One evening, I confronted Dad. We were sitting on the back porch. The sun was setting. Everything looked peaceful, but I wasn't. "Why did you trust him?" Dad closed his eyes. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. "Because he's my son." I looked away. The answer hurt more than I expected, because I realized something. Dad hadn't trusted Jason because the investment made sense. He trusted him because he wanted to believe in him. Wanted to believe Jason would finally succeed. Wanted to believe his son would become responsible. Hope had blinded him, and now all of us were paying the price. A few weeks later, another surprise arrived. I received a partial scholarship from a university I'd applied to, not enough to cover everything, but enough to give me a chance. When I opened the letter, I cried, not because the scholarship solved my problems, because it reminded me that my future wasn't completely gone. There was still hope, small hope, fragile hope. But hope nonetheless. That night Mom hugged me tightly. "We're proud of you," I smiled. But deep down something had changed. I still loved my parents, but trust wasn't as simple anymore. The foundation had cracked, and cracks don't disappear overnight. College began that fall. I moved into a tiny dorm room. Most students arrived with excitement. Parents carried boxes. Families celebrated. Mine did too. But underneath every smile was a painful truth. We all knew things should have been different. Every student loan I signed reminded me of Jason. Every extra shift I worked reminded me of Jason. Every financial struggle reminded me of Jason. His shadow followed me everywhere, even when he wasn't there. My first semester was brutal. Classes were demanding. Money was tight. Stress became constant. There were nights when I survived on instant noodles because I couldn't afford much else. There were weekends when I stayed on campus, while friends traveled home because gas money wasn't in my budget. But I kept going, because every obstacle strengthened my resolve. Every challenge proved something important. Jason had stolen my money, but he hadn't stolen my determination. And that made all the difference. Back home, things weren't much better. Mom and Dad argued more often. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. The betrayal had damaged everyone. Even Jason seemed to visit less frequently. Maybe guilt was finally catching up to him, Or maybe he simply didn't want to face what he'd done. Either way, the family I once knew was disappearing. Slowly, painfully, piece by piece. Then, during my second year of college, something unexpected happened. Jason called me. We hadn't spoken much in months. The conversation felt awkward from the beginning. "Sophia, what do you want?" A long pause followed. Then he said something strange. "I think things are finally turning around." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "I've got a business opportunity." The words instantly made my stomach tighten. Another opportunity, another shortcut, another dream, another lie. I almost laughed. Instead, I said nothing, and Jason continued. "You'll see." There was confidence in his voice, confidence I'd never heard before. At the time, I dismissed it. Just another scheme. Just another failed plan waiting to happen. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that this new opportunity would eventually make Jason richer than any of us could have imagined. And years later, that fortune would become the very thing that destroyed him. When Jason called and told me he had finally found a successful business opportunity, I didn't believe him. Honestly, why would I? For years, every great opportunity he'd talked about had ended the same way. Failure, excuses, and someone else paying the price. So after that phone call, I pushed the conversation out of my mind and focused on my own life. I had enough problems already. College wasn't getting easier. Every semester brought new expenses. New challenges, new reasons to feel overwhelmed, but despite everything, I was surviving. Actually, I was doing more than surviving. I was succeeding. My grades remained strong. Professors noticed my dedication. A few even encouraged me to apply for competitive internships. For the first time since losing my college fund, I felt like I was building something again. A future that belonged to me, a future nobody could take away. At least that's what I thought. Over the next 2 years, Jason and I barely spoke. Birthdays, holidays, occasional family gatherings. That was it. Our relationship had become polite but distant, like two strangers connected only by blood. Mom hated it. Dad hated it too, but neither of them knew how to fix what had been broken. And honestly, neither did I. Some wounds heal slowly. Others leave scars forever. Jason's betrayal had become one of those scars. Then something strange started happening. Every time I came home from college, Jason seemed different. At first, it was small things: a nicer watch, expensive clothes, a newer car, nothing outrageous, just enough to make me notice. One Thanksgiving, he pulled into my parents' driveway driving a black luxury SUV, the kind of vehicle that cost more than my entire year of tuition. Dad walked outside and stared. "That's yours," Jason grinned. "Sure is." "How?" Jason laughed. "Business is good." That was all he said. Business is good. The answer sounded simple, too simple, but everyone accepted it. Even me, for a while. 6 months later, the changes became impossible to ignore. The SUV became a sports car. The sports car became two sports cars. The designer clothes multiplied. The vacations became more extravagant. Miami, Las Vegas, the Caribbean. Photos appeared everywhere online. Pictures of Jason standing beside luxury boats. Pictures of expensive restaurants. Pictures of penthouse views. Every image felt surreal. This was the same man who couldn't hold a job, the same man who had destroyed my college fund. The same man who spent years bouncing from one failed idea to another. Now suddenly he was successful. It didn't make sense, not completely, but I had no proof otherwise, so I focused on my own goals. Eventually, graduation arrived, one of the proudest moments of my life. 4 years earlier, losing my college fund had felt like the end. Now I stood in a cap and gown with an architecture degree in my hands. I had done it. Not because life had been easy, because I refused to quit. When my name was called, I looked into the audience. Mom was crying, Dad was cheering, even Jason was there, clapping, smiling, acting supportive. After the ceremony, he approached me. "I'm proud of you, Soph," I nodded politely. "Thanks." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me. "You know, maybe we can work together someday." I almost laughed. "Doing what?" "Building things," he smiled. "I'm getting into real estate development." there was confidence in his voice, confidence backed by money, real money, and for the first time, a tiny question entered my mind. What if Jason had actually changed? After graduation, I accepted a position at a respected architecture firm in Columbus. The salary wasn't amazing, but it was a start. I rented a small apartment, bought secondhand furniture, and began building a life independent of my family. For a while, things felt peaceful. Then Jason became impossible to ignore because his success kept growing. And growing and growing. Within 3 years, he owned multiple properties, commercial buildings, rental complexes, development projects. The local newspaper even featured him in an article about young entrepreneurs. I remember reading the headline, "Self-made businessman transforms local real estate market." Self-made. That phrase bothered me more than it should have, because I knew something the newspaper didn't. I knew where part of his original money had come from, my college fund, the fund he'd destroyed. The fund nobody ever recovered. Yet there he was, being celebrated, admired, praised, while nobody knew the truth. One Christmas, the entire family gathered at my parents' house. It was the first holiday Jason had hosted financially. He arrived carrying expensive gifts for everyone, a luxury handbag for mom, a high-end tool set for dad, gift cards, electronics, designer accessories. The room buzzed with excitement. Everyone admired his generosity. Everyone praised his success. Everyone except me, because every gift felt strange, like a performance. Like a public display designed to erase the past. At one point, Jason handed me an envelope. Inside was a check, $10,000. I stared at it, confused. "What's this?" "A gift." I looked up. "A gift," he nodded. "You deserve it." For a moment, the room fell silent. Everyone watched me, waiting, hoping, praying. Maybe this was the moment everything would heal. Maybe this was the apology we'd all been waiting for. Then I asked the question nobody expected. "Is this repayment?" Jason's smile disappeared. "What?" "The college fund." The room instantly became uncomfortable. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I held up the check. "Is this repayment?" Jason's jaw tightened. "It doesn't have to be about that." I placed the check back into the envelope. "Then I don't want it." The drive home that night felt strangely emotional. Part of me wondered if I'd made the wrong choice. $10,000 would have helped, a lot, but another part of me knew something important. The issue had never been money. Not really. The issue was accountability, and Jason still refused to take responsibility, even after all these years. As time passed, Jason's empire continued expanding. By age 32, he was worth millions. Millions, the number sounded ridiculous, yet somehow it was true. He purchased a mansion outside the city, started appearing at charity events, began networking with wealthy investors. People treated him like a success story, a role model, someone worthy of admiration. The more successful he became, the more uncomfortable I felt, not because I was jealous. Because something felt wrong, deeply wrong. Jason wasn't a financial genius. He wasn't disciplined. He wasn't patient. Those qualities had never existed, so how had he built an empire? Where had the money really come from? What was I missing? The answer arrived completely by accident. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I was leaving work when my phone rang, an unfamiliar number. Normally, I would have ignored it. For some reason, I answered. "Hello?" The man on the other end sounded hesitant. "Is this Sophia Carter?" "Yes, my name is Robert Hayes." I didn't recognize the name. "Okay." There was a pause, then he said something unexpected. "I used to be one of Jason's business partners." My attention sharpened instantly. "What about him?" Another pause. The man sounded nervous, like someone debating whether to reveal a dangerous secret. Finally, he spoke. "I think you deserve to know something." My heart began beating faster. "What?" The rain tapped against my windshield. The parking lot sat nearly empty around me, and suddenly every instinct told me this conversation was important, very important. Robert exhaled slowly, then asked a question that changed everything. "Do you know where Jason got his startup money?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" The money he used to launch his first major investment company. I assumed investors. No, the answer came immediately, confidently. Absolutely. No investors. A chill ran through me. What are you talking about? Robert lowered his voice, as if he were afraid someone might hear. The money came from your family. I froze. The words echoed inside my head. My family. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. That's impossible. I thought so too. What exactly are you saying? The next few words would uncover a secret bigger than the stolen college fund. A secret my parents had hidden for years. A secret capable of destroying everything Jason had built. And as I listened to Robert speak, I realized my brother's betrayal had been far worse than I ever imagined. I sat frozen in my car as rain tapped against the windshield. My phone was pressed tightly against my ear. Every muscle in my body felt tense. Robert Hayes had just told me something that made no sense. The money came from your family. I stared through the rain-covered glass. No, I said quietly. That's impossible, Robert sighed. I wish it was. A chill moved through me. For years, I had believed the worst thing Jason ever did was steal my college fund. For years, I had carried that betrayal like a scar. But now, something told me I had only seen a small part of the truth. What exactly are you talking about? I asked. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Then Robert finally spoke. Your brother never had enough money to start his first development company. I listened carefully. He needed capital. Okay. He told investors he had family-backed assets. My stomach tightened. What assets? Robert hesitated. Then he answered. The Carter house. My heart stopped. For a second, I couldn't even speak. The house? Yes. I felt dizzy. No. I'm sorry, Sophia. No. The word escaped my lips automatically because there was no way. No way my parents would risk their home. No way they would allow Jason access to something that important. No way, but deep down, I already knew. I knew because suddenly so many things made sense. Dad's stress, Mom's anxiety, the arguments, the silence, the guilt, all of it. I gripped the steering wheel. When, about a year after the college fund disappeared, the answer hit me like a punch. A year, a full year, and nobody had told me. That night I drove straight to my parents' house. I didn't call ahead, I didn't warn anyone. I simply drove. The entire trip felt unreal. Questions flooded my mind. How much had Jason taken? Why would my parents agree? How long had they hidden it? Most importantly, why had they never told me? When I arrived, the kitchen lights were on. Dad was sitting at the table reading. Mom was washing dishes. Everything looked normal. Painfully normal. Until they saw my face. Immediately they knew something was wrong. Sophia, Mom asked. I placed my purse on the table, slowly, carefully. Then I looked directly at them. Did Jason mortgage the house? The room instantly went silent. Mom stopped moving. Dad lowered his eyes, and in that moment, I had my answer. The betrayal hurt more than I expected. Not because of Jason, because of them, my parents, the people I trusted most, the people who taught me honesty, the people who had hidden the truth. How long? I asked. Nobody answered. How long? Dad finally spoke. 7 years. 7 years. 7 years of secrets. 7 years of silence. 7 years of pretending everything was fine. I sat down slowly, trying to process it. Trying to breathe, trying not to cry. Mom walked toward me. We didn't want to hurt you, I laughed bitterly. Hurt me? Tears filled my eyes. You let me believe the college fund was the worst thing he did. Mom started crying, but I couldn't stop, not anymore. He took my future. I looked at Dad. And then he took your house too. Dad's face crumbled. For the first time, I saw how much guilt he carried. The years had aged him, broken him, changed him. He promised he would pay it back. The words sounded familiar, painfully familiar. Promises. Jason always had promises. Over the next hour, the entire truth came out. After losing my college fund, Jason had spent months convincing Dad he could recover everything. He claimed he had discovered a real business opportunity, a legitimate one, a chance to rebuild. A chance to repay everyone. At first, Dad refused, But Jason kept pushing, kept persuading, kept promising. Eventually, my parents agreed to refinance their home. The money became Jason's startup capital, and this time, the business actually worked. At least in the beginning, the investment succeeded. Properties increased in value, money started flowing. Soon Jason's company began growing rapidly. Then it exploded. Millions followed, success followed, recognition followed, but despite all that wealth, he never repaid my parents properly. Never removed their risk, never fully protected them. Instead, he continued using their property and financial backing while presenting himself as self-made. The more I listened, the angrier I became. Not because Jason had become wealthy, because he had built his empire on trust he never earned. For days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The story haunted me. Every success Jason celebrated suddenly looked different. Every luxury car, every vacation, every newspaper article, every public speech. All of it rested on a foundation built with other people's sacrifices. My sacrifice, my parents' sacrifice. The deeper I thought about it, the more questions appeared, questions that refused to leave. Eventually, I called Robert back. We met 3 days later, a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. Robert was older than I expected, early 60s, professional, calm. The kind of man who paid attention to details. After introductions, he slid a folder across the table. I looked down. What is this? Documentation. My heart began racing. What kind of documentation? Robert leaned forward. The kind that explains why I left Jason's company. For the next 2 hours, Robert walked me through records, contracts, property transfers, loan agreements, corporate filings. At first, much of it seemed confusing. Then patterns began emerging, and the more I learned, the worse everything became. Jason hadn't simply used family money. He had structured multiple deals around assets connected to my parents. Several business loans relied on guarantees tied to their financial history. Certain investments involved ownership arrangements that weren't publicly disclosed. The public story and the real story weren't the same, not even close. Robert looked exhausted as he explained everything. I warned him. What happened? He stopped listening. That answer didn't surprise me. Success had always made Jason arrogant. Now he had millions. I could only imagine how untouchable he felt. Over the following months, I began investigating quietly. Not because I wanted revenge. At least that's what I told myself. The truth was more complicated. Part of me wanted justice. Part of me wanted answers. Part of me wanted Jason to finally face consequences. For years, he had escaped responsibility. Every mistake. Every betrayal, every broken promise, someone else always paid. This time felt different. For the first time in his life, evidence existed. Real evidence, documents, records, paper trails, facts. Things that couldn't be ignored. One evening, I sat across from Dad on the back porch. The same porch where we'd once discussed my stolen college fund. The same porch where he had admitted trusting Jason because he was his son. The sunset painted the sky orange. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Dad finally asked the question. What are you going to do? I looked toward the horizon. Honestly, I wasn't sure. Part of me wanted to walk away, forget everything, live my life, move forward. But another part knew something important. If nobody confronted the truth, Jason would continue hurting people. Maybe not intentionally, maybe not maliciously, but the result would be the same. People would suffer, because Jason always believed rules applied to everyone except him. The turning point came 6 months later. A former investor contacted Robert. That investor contacted another investor. Soon several people started comparing experiences. Questions appeared, concerns appeared, doubts appeared. The image Jason had spent years building began developing cracks. Small cracks, but cracks nonetheless, and once cracks appear, they grow. I watched everything carefully, quietly, patiently. For the first time in years, the balance of power was shifting. Jason didn't know it yet, but his empire wasn't as secure as he believed. The foundation beneath it was beginning to move. And foundations matter. No matter how beautiful the building looks, if the foundation is weak, eventually everything collapses. Then one morning, my phone rang. It was Robert. His voice sounded serious, very serious. "They've opened a formal investigation." My heart skipped. "Who?" "The investors." I stood from my desk. "What happens now?" Robert paused. Then he answered with words I'd never forget. "Now the truth starts coming out." And at that moment, I realized something. For years, Jason had controlled the story. For years, he had controlled the narrative. For years, he had controlled the truth. But not anymore. Because the empire he'd built on secrets was finally being forced into the light. And once that happened, nothing would ever be the same again. The morning Robert told me investors had opened a formal investigation, I knew one thing for certain. Jason's life was about to change. For years, he had been the one asking questions, making decisions, controlling situations. Now other people were asking the questions, and Jason was the one expected to answer them. At first, nothing happened publicly. Weeks passed, then months. From the outside, everything looked normal. Jason still attended charity events, still posted photos online, still appeared confident, still acted like the successful businessman everyone admired. But behind closed doors, the pressure was growing. I knew because Robert occasionally updated me. More records were being reviewed. More financial documents were being requested. More investors were demanding explanations. And every answer seemed to create even more questions. The cracks in Jason's empire were spreading. Slowly. But steadily, one afternoon I received a call from Mom. Her voice sounded worried. "Sophia, what's wrong?" "It's Jason." My stomach tightened immediately. "What happened?" "He's been arguing with lawyers all week." I sat down. The concern in her voice was obvious. "Did he say why?" "No." A pause followed. Then she quietly added, "He looks scared." Those words stayed with me long after the conversation ended, because fear was something I'd never associated with Jason. Confidence? Yes. Arrogance? Definitely. Fear? Never. Yet suddenly people were noticing it. And that meant things were getting serious. As the investigation continued, more information surfaced. Some investors claimed they had received incomplete financial disclosures. Others questioned ownership structures tied to certain properties. Several business relationships began falling apart. Partners who once praised Jason started distancing themselves. People who once trusted him became cautious. The reputation he spent years building was beginning to crumble. And reputation is a strange thing. It takes years to build, minutes to destroy. Then came the first lawsuit, followed by another, and another. Each one brought new attention, new scrutiny. New problems. The local business community started talking. Reporters started asking questions. Articles appeared, nothing explosive at first, just enough to create doubt. But doubt spreads quickly. Especially when money is involved. Soon lenders became cautious. Investors became nervous. Business deals stalled, projects slowed. The momentum that once made Jason unstoppable suddenly began working against him. Everything that had risen rapidly was now falling just as fast. I wish I could tell you I celebrated. I wish I could tell you watching him struggle made me happy, but it didn't, not really. Mostly I felt sad, sad for my parents, sad for our family, sad for the years we had lost. Because none of this had to happen. Jason had opportunities, he had support, he had people who loved him. If he had simply been honest from the beginning, things could have been different. But honesty requires accountability, and accountability was something he'd spent most of his life avoiding. A few months later, my phone rang unexpectedly. The screen displayed Jason's name. For several seconds, I just stared at it, then I answered. "Hello," silence, then his voice. "Sophia." I immediately noticed something. He sounded different, older, tired, defeated. "What do you want?" Another long pause, then he spoke. "I need your help." I closed my eyes, of course, after all these years, after all the damage, after everything. Now he needed help. The irony was almost painful. "What kind of help?" "I don't know." His voice cracked slightly. He stopped speaking. For the first time in my life, Jason sounded lost, completely lost. We met 3 days later. A small cafe near downtown. Nothing fancy, nothing impressive, just a quiet place to talk. When Jason walked in, I barely recognized him. The expensive confidence was gone. The polished image was gone. The certainty was gone. For the first time, he looked like a man carrying the weight of his choices. He sat down across from me. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he looked up. "I messed up." The words surprised me, not because they were dramatic, because they were honest. Maybe the first truly honest words I'd heard from him in years. I nodded slowly. "Yes." He looked away. "I never meant for any of this to happen." The statement sounded sincere, but sincerity doesn't erase consequences. I took a deep breath. Then asked the question I had carried for years. "Did you ever think about what happened to me?" Jason didn't answer. "Did you ever think about what losing that college fund did to me?" Still silence. I continued. "Did you ever think about Mom and Dad?" His eyes filled with tears, and finally, he shook his head. No, that single word said everything. No excuses, no explanations, no blame, just truth, painful truth. Over the next year, Jason's empire continued collapsing. Properties were sold. Projects were canceled. Assets were liquidated. Debt obligations mounted. Legal settlements followed. One by one, pieces of his fortune disappeared. The mansion was sold. Several luxury vehicles were sold. Investment holdings were transferred or dissolved. Everything he'd spent years building began vanishing. Not overnight, but steadily, relentlessly. Like a tide pulling away from shore, then something unexpected happened. As legal matters were resolved, investigators determined that portions of recovered assets should be directed toward parties financially affected by earlier arrangements, including my parents. For the first time in years, Mom and Dad received meaningful compensation connected to the risks they had carried. I still remember the day Dad called me. His voice was shaking. "We got it back." I sat quietly, not fully understanding. "What?" "The money." Tears filled my eyes, not because we were suddenly wealthy. Because a burden that had haunted my parents for years was finally lifting. The guilt, the fear, the regret, all of it. For the first time in a very long time, they could breathe again. Several months later, my parents invited me to dinner. Nothing unusual, just family. The same kitchen, the same table, the same place where years earlier my world had fallen apart. After dessert, Dad slid an envelope across the table. I looked at him. "What's this?" Mom smiled softly. "Open it." Inside was a financial document, a transfer, a significant one. I stared at it. Confused. "What is this?" Dad's eyes filled with emotion. "It's yours." I immediately shook my head. "No, Sophia." "No." Mom reached across the table. "Honey, please." I looked back at the document. The amount represented a meaningful portion of the recovered funds. Money connected to sacrifices that had affected all of us. Money my parents wanted me to have. My throat tightened. For years I had carried anger. For years I had carried hurt. Now, sitting at that table, I realized something. The money wasn't the important part. The acknowledgement was, the recognition, the understanding. The fact that someone had finally said, "What happened to you was wrong." And that mattered more than any dollar amount ever could. As for Jason, his life became much quieter. The headlines disappeared, the attention disappeared, the admiration disappeared. For a while, he stayed away from family gatherings. Embarrassment does that. Shame does that. But eventually, little by little, he returned. Not as the successful businessman, not as the golden child. Not as the center of attention, just as Jason, a flawed human being learning difficult lessons, the way the rest of us do. Today, when people hear my story, they often ask the same question. Was it worth it? They're usually talking about the investigation, the legal battles, the consequences, the collapse of Jason's fortune. My answer is always complicated. Because revenge wasn't what ultimately healed me. Truth did. Accountability did. Justice did. Watching reality finally catch up with years of deception did. The fortune Jason lost wasn't really money. Money can be replaced. The real fortune he lost was trust. And trust is far more valuable. Once it's broken, rebuilding it can take a lifetime. Looking back now, I realize something important. When my college fund disappeared, I thought my future had been stolen. I thought my story was ending. I thought my dreams had been destroyed. But I was wrong. My future wasn't hiding inside a bank account. It was inside me, inside my determination, inside my resilience, inside my refusal to quit. The money mattered. Of course it did. But character mattered more. And character was something nobody could steal, not even my brother. So if there's one lesson I learned from everything that happened, it's this. The people who betray you may take opportunities. They may take money. They may even take years from your life. But they cannot take your ability to rise again. They cannot take your strength. They cannot take your future unless you surrender it. And sometimes, the greatest victory isn't watching someone fall. It's continuing to rise after they tried to bring you down. My name is Sophia Carter. And that's how my brother took my college fund. But lost the fortune he built trying to replace it.